One of the most important weapons of the Roman army was the pilum, or javelin, a specialised throwing spear made famous by the Roman legions. But one of the great questions about these is how were they actually deployed and used by Roman armies? Specifically, did they take a run-up? Now obviously if we look at modern javelin throwing, they pretty much always take a run-up to get maximum distance. There's no question that it adds to the energy put into the weapon, to the velocity that you get out of it. But the question is, how would that work if you were in formation with shields? And did they actually even need to do that? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, as I've highlighted in previous videos, and I'm sure I'll continue to do, spears of various sorts were actually very, very important to the Romans. Not only did they use hand spears, long spears, together with the scutum or large shield here, but also famously they used forms of throwing spear or javelin like this pilum. Now, it's important to state that while many people think of the Romans as famous for using the gladius or sword, which is obviously something we focus on a lot in this channel, in fact, the use of various types of spear was incredibly important to them, and of course the use of the massive scutum and the use of large shields of various shapes and forms, but generally quite big like this, was really characteristic to the way that they fought. Now, while many nations and many cultures used spears and javelins of various sorts, this specific type, known as the pilum, was really particular to the Romans. Not to say other people didn't use forms of this. Certainly the Gauls probably had something a little bit similar to this, and you know, the Romans like to copy stuff from elsewhere, but the fact is that they really made this their own, and they made it part of their strategy. They made it part of their tactics on the battlefield to throw these into the enemy ranks. And just by way of a little bit of background context, while this is a fairly typical kind of average form you'll often see replicas of here, with a long shank and a sort of triangular, almost bodkin-like point, a reinforced wooden section here, secured with a tang and rivets, you'll notice. So it's not a socket like most spears would be, but in fact it's a tanged construction, a little bit like some Japanese stuff actually, with pins or rivets going through, a wooden shaft and a butt spike at the back end. So this is a very particular thing, but not all pila are like this. Some of them have a more bulbous weight up here, some possibly had lead additional weighting, some of them have a shorter shank, some actually have a barbed head rather than a triangular head like that, some even just have a thin pointed shank, and they also have shafts of different lengths, and not all of them necessarily have the butt spike. So while this is the most kind of typical and average and most famous type of pilum, there are other forms around, and no doubt some of them probably would have been used slightly differently at different ranges for different purposes, and importantly against different opponents. For example, you might choose a heavier, harder hitting, shorter range pilum against opponents who are going to be relatively heavily armoured, for example like Gauls, but you might use lighter, longer range, more nimble, further flying javelins against more lightly equipped opponents like Britons, for example. But for the purposes of this video, there's one really important piece of context, and that is shields. So the fact that you can throw a javelin doesn't necessarily mean that you're used to doing it with a shield in hand. And of course, this is usually the thing that Roman legionaries had in their other hand. And this does limit your capacity to run. It also, if you do run, it kind of makes the shield potentially slightly less useful. Also, running would mean you'd leave formation, but we'll come back to that in a second. But the point is that throwing a javelin is inherently changed by the fact that you are holding a pretty large and heavy shield in the other hand. Now, the funny thing is, if we look at the modern Olympic sport of javelin throwing, of course we never have anything in the other hand. In fact, I used to throw javelin at school on my school athletics team. And the fact is that usually you're concentrating entirely on getting that as far as possible. And indeed, there would have been troop types used by various cultures in the Roman era that would have been doing that. But that doesn't necessarily apply to the standard Roman soldier who is wearing armour and carrying a large shield. So the question we're trying to answer here really is, how do you get the maximum energy and power out of a weapon like this when you're also carrying a shield? Well, one possibility is they could have put the shields down, given a good run up and hurl them as hard as possible, and then run back to the lines and pick up their shield again. Do I think they did this? No, I don't. And fundamentally, I don't think they needed to. Let's look at why. So first up, this is not designed for range. When we look at types of missile that are created for range, they're generally light. They are not built like a pilum. This pilum is made for short range power, and I'm going to illustrate on this target behind here, which is a mere 10 yards away, but let me tell you, 10 yards is probably about the distance that you would be throwing these at opponents as they come in, either they charge in or you charge in. So if you took a run up, yes, it would add a bit of power to it, but do you need to? Well, fundamentally, probably not, but we'll come back to that later. So first of all, I'm just going to throw this javelin at that target, and just to illustrate what happens, because you probably have a rough idea of what arrows do to archery targets. This is a fairly new archery target, and that is the penetration we're getting through it. You can see there, really quite deep. Not quite so deep that time, but still easily sticking right the way through the target. This time I'll try a little bit more force. Hopefully you can see that is way through the target. Now let's try it on a shield. This is a sacrificial target shield that's been used before for various missiles, and this is about the thickness that we would have found a scutum, so an enemy scutum, for example, during the civil wars, of about the thickness of a Roman shield of the time. So I put my thumb against the shank, so you can see, so it went that far through the shield and actually embedded in the target behind. Let's have another go. That one didn't go so far through, but it went through the leather pad at the back, and it actually knocked the target over, which absorbed quite a lot of the energy. Let's have one more go. So again, it went about 8 inches through and actually impaled the target behind and knocked the archery stand over. And a little detail, I know a lot of you will say in the comments, oh, these were meant to bend in the shield. Very rarely happens based on our experiments and other people I know as well with other recreations. But what does happen is you end up with the weapon stuck through the shield, and it's because of the shape of the head, whether it's barbed or unbarbed, it's actually quite difficult to get it out. So if you are carrying a shield and you get one of these stuck in the front, your shield might be useless anyway. But perhaps most importantly, the real primary goal of this is to hit the person behind the shield. So rule 1, penetrate through far enough to wound the person behind the shield. I think that's the primary purpose of the pilum. The secondary benefit is you end up with a pilum hanging out of their shield, which is clearly a disadvantage to them. Oh man, oh, this thing really doesn't want to come out. So to conclude, do I think that the Romans were running forwards to throw their pila? Not very often, no. I don't think it's necessary. Fundamentally, I do not think that you need to take a run up to throw a pilum, because they are short range, impact, shock and awe weapons to be used at very close range, just before you get into hand-to-hand combat, before you pull your gladius out. In some cases, if you did need to offend people who are a bit further away, if they were standing there defensively, would you possibly take a run up? Would you possibly put your shield down? Possibly yes. But in standard formations with a shield, you don't want to be running around, because the shield is big and cumbersome, you're likely to fall over it, or you're just likely to expose yourself anyway to enemy missiles. By and large, this isn't a good distance weapon. You cannot throw this as far as a modern Olympic javelin. You can't throw it as far as a plumbata. You certainly can't send it as far as enemy arrows or slingshots. And I think that's the point here. This is not a range weapon. So why do a run-up? As we've seen in that experiment there, and I've shown previously against male and other targets, this is really powerful at close range anyway. It's powerful enough to go straight through bodies, straight through shields and offend the bodies behind. It can go through mail. It might not go through plate armor, usually, possibly in some strange circumstances if it's thinner iron, possibly. But by and large, this weapon is extremely potent at close range and is either going to wound people through their shield or disable their shield. So it's a very effective shock weapon just before hand-to-hand combat. It is not a long-range missile weapon. If you want to do long-range missiles, get bows, slings, or plumbata. And it's also worth mentioning, there were longer-range javelins that the Romans were using. So this isn't it, okay? So, do I think the Romans were doing run-ups? Very, very rarely. I think they would have been focusing on staying in formation, keeping their shield formation. I think they would have been using these at the last possible minute, at 10 yards, 15 yards max, to chuck these into the enemies or into their shields before pulling out the gladius. So do I think they took a run-up? No. Very rarely. I hope that answers the question. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks. And I want to thank my friend for this video, Arlo.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.